welcome to the Solar Oration for 2021. It's a bit surprising it's actually going ahead in both physical and virtual worlds, but it's great that a bunch of us can actually meet physically. So I'm Andrew Blakers, I'm a Professor of Engineering at the Australian National University. And before we start, I'll do an acknowledgement of country, acknowledge the Ngunnawal people who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, pay respects to the elders past and present and emerging, and extend my respect to to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in attendance today, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. So a quick admin note before we begin. The Q&A session tonight will be through the online platform Vivox. This is actually likely to be more practical than running around with microphone. And you can access it through the details that are displayed on the screen. So if you do that now, then you can set up your Q&A for when the questions actually come at the end. They're also available on the event registration page. So our first speaker is Minister Shane Rattenbury, who is the leader of the ACT Greens and is currently the ACT Minister for Water, Energy and Emissions Reduction. So he was elected to the ACT Legislative Assembly in 2008 and has held a bunch of ministerial platforms, including education, road safety, housing, among others. But of course, throughout, he's had a strong focus on energy and emissions. So welcome, Shane, and we look forward to a few minutes of update on what's happening in Canberra.
Terrific. Good evening, everybody. Sorry for the technical fail there. We've been on mute and I wasn't quite sure where we're up to, but good evening, everybody. It's lovely to join you, and I'm sorry I can't be there in person tonight. The Assembly is still sitting and I'm stuck in the building on the other side of Civic. Dara wa Nana, Dara wa Ngunnawal. We are, of course, on Ngunnawal country, and I pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land we gather on. This year has particularly highlighted the urgency of the climate change situation, from the accelerating physical impacts we see right across the planet, and we are seeing those examples in various corners of the world, through to the clear science laid out in the 6th Assessment Report. The urgency of climate action has been made crystal clear for us. If it wasn't already, after 2021, it is even more so. And then, of course, we've just had Glasgow, and I think that was a source of both optimism and frustration. For me, the optimism came from the pressure for 2030 targets, the recognition that this is the critical decade. We also saw significant mainstream discussion of the need to phase out fossil fuel use. And we saw lots of partnerships being formed, whether it was the methane partnership, efforts on green shipping, and plenty of others right across the negotiations. There was a lot of very positive work happening. On the negative side, I don't think the ambition coming out of Glasgow matches the science. For all of the fine words that we saw, at the end of the day, there were countries who were blocking progress. There were countries who did not come with strong enough commitments. And, of course, headlining that queue was Australia. And that, as an Australian, is very hard to watch. I've been to a few COPs myself in the past, and Australia has been playing this role for many years. But I think they were particularly exposed this year for the failure of leadership by our federal government. Australia's role, both at Glasgow and what we've seen in our domestic politics in the last couple of years, really highlights the importance of state and territory governments and local councils and the corporate sector and community organisations in taking the lead. And we are seeing right across the country significant movement in all of those sectors. We have a very clear understanding that the federal government is a follower on this issue. They are not a leader, they are a follower. And even when they are following, they are being dragged kicking and screaming. And so the importance of states and territories acting, as I say, local councils, right across the board. We all have to get in and do our bit because the federal government is not providing the leadership we need from them when it comes to climate change. My role at this annual event is to provide a quick update on the ACT's progress. Let me give you a few of the highlights, and then we can get on to our keynote speaker for the evening. But the ACT does remain a leader on climate action, both nationally and internationally. And there's a range of examples that demonstrate that. We've just won another award for our Zero Emission Vehicle Action Plan. We have now achieved nearly 45% reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions off a 1990 baseline. Our legislated target was 40% by 2020, so we've met that. It's probably been aided a little bit by COVID, but we've actually got there. And it demonstrates what is possible when you set targets, you set your mind to it, and you follow through. We, of course, continue to be powered by 100% renewable electricity. In terms of household action in the ACT, the recently opened Sustainable Household Scheme, which provides interest-free loans of up to $15,000 to householders, has got off to a great start. It's designed to help reduce energy use, reduce energy bills, and support the development of the renewable energy industry in the ACT. There's a range of products available under the scheme. We've got rooftop solar PV, batteries, hot water heat pumps, electric heating and cooling systems, electric stove tops, as well as charging infrastructure. And very shortly, I expect we'll be adding electric vehicles or zero-emission vehicles to the list of eligible items that you can get an interest-free loan for. That'll commence this month. And from early next year, we plan to bring community organisations and not-for-profits into the scheme as well to help them make their moves to being lower-emission organisations. As of mid-November, we had over 1,600 households that have applied for a loan through the scheme, around $17 million worth of loans. Loan applications are in the system. And we've already had over 400 installations of solar panels under the scheme, which equates to around 3 megawatts of solar installed. So that's a pretty good start to the scheme, given it's only been live for a couple of months. When it comes to energy efficiency, and we can never forget this in the important battle of tackling greenhouse emissions, we are just out for public consultation at the moment on creating minimum energy performance standards for rental properties in the ACT. Now, this is a very particular issue, but for too long in the Territory, people have been living in or renting houses that are freezing cold in winter, too hot in summer. They're uncomfortable and they have big energy bills. And I'm determined to make sure that we do that. And our plan is to start with requiring, a minimum level of ceiling insulation in all rental properties. We're moving down the path of having more all-electric buildings in the Territory. In 2019, the government committed that all new government buildings would be efficient and all-electric buildings. We've now got 2 all-electric schools in the ACT. We've got the Dixon office building for the government is all-electric. We're in the process of designing and building the new expansion for the hospital, one of the first in the Southern Hemisphere to move away from having a gas turbine and being all-electric, and the new CIT building at Woden, which is more than a $250 million investment, will be an all-electric building as well. As I've probably told many of you before, transport remains our big challenge in the ACT, and more than 60% of our emissions now come in the transport sector. And with COVID, we're actually seeing trends where people are taking less public transport, and we're actually seeing worse traffic congestion in Australia. We've put in place a range of incentives. We've got zero stamp duty for zero-emission vehicles. We've now got 2 years of free registration, and with those interest-free loans coming as well, it's really making it much more affordable for Canberrans to get EVs. Since the introduction of free registration in May, there have been 372 additional zero-emission vehicles registered in the Territory, which is around a 36% increase in just 6 months. And so we feel that some of those policy settings we're putting in place really are the right incentives to get people across the line. The ACT is also now one of the biggest owners of zero-emission vehicles in Australia. We've got 170 vehicles, or they're leased, but they're in our fleet. And it makes us one of the biggest fleet owners in Australia of zero-emission vehicles, which for a small Territory government, I reckon is a pretty decent achievement. Look, let me conclude, because my slot is a short one at the front, to simply say we remain on track for achieving our ambitious climate targets. We've met that first one. The next one's at 2025, and we've got them in 2030, 2040, and zero net emissions by 2045. It gets harder from here, but we are continuing to put in place these programs where people are getting on board. And I think if we could get some stronger leadership from the federal government, it would all be a lot easier. So I want to thank the ANU for this opportunity to join in tonight, as well as our continued partnerships right across the city. We're seeing some really excellent leadership, particularly from the university sector, and I look forward to both tonight's presentation but the continuing important work coming out of ANU. Thanks very much.
So thank you very much, Shane. And we know that you might have to go off to do your other duties, but of course you're welcome to stay and watch if you have a bit of time. Okay, so there are two presentations. There's a 15-minute initial presentation from Marta Victoria, and she is in Denmark. She's an assistant professor at the Department of Mechanical and Production Engineering at Aarhus University, and she focuses on modelling of large-scale energy systems with high renewable penetration, paying special attention to the role of solar photovoltaics. So she was first author of an international Joule paper just very recently, basically pointing out that most of the modelling you might hear about is wrong, in that it has woefully inadequate and incorrect data for the cost of solar photovoltaics. So we're going to hear a little bit more about that over the next 15 minutes. So Marta has a recorded presentation, and we look forward to hearing that.
Hello, everyone. Let me start saying thank you very much for inviting me to be here. It's a real pleasure to join, even online, and discussions regarding the future of solar energy. Let me share my presentation. All right. What I would like to introduce today is this topic on solar photovoltaics being ready to power a sustainable future. Let me start by saying that, unfortunately, we have bad news. And the bad news is that we are running out of time. So we know that if we want to limit temperature increase to 1.5 or 2 degrees, we have a limited amount of CO2 that we can emit. We call this the carbon budget. And we are depleting that carbon budget. So if we look at the historical global emissions, let's say if we would have started reducing CO2 emissions in 2000, we could have followed this blue line and slowly reduce emissions, but we didn't do that. So now, let's assume around 2018, 2020, if we want to reduce emissions now and remain within this carbon budget, we need a 10% CO2 reduction per year, so this black line. And what is more important, if we don't do enough, if we don't take enough climate action for the next decade, and we end up in 2030 without the climate action being taken, we will need a reduction of around 30% per year, which is probably unfeasible. In the words of the recent IPCC fifth assessment report, unless there are immediate, rapid, and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees will be beyond reach. Let me also combine this bad news with somehow other more positive news. The positive news are related to the fact that we are witnesses a solar photovoltaic revolution. So we look at the global electricity generation from the 1970s. We see that, of course, most of the electricity today is produced with coal, hydro, gas, and nuclear. But now we need also to pay attention to what's going on in the recent years, because we can see the fast ramp up of wind and in particular of solar PV, which is the technology showing the fastest ramp up and all of that on all the electricity generation technologies. So as I mentioned, we are actually witnessing this strongly, this dramatic solar PV revolution. But many future energy scenarios underestimate that potential role that PV could play in the future. And this is when a group of researchers realized that this was going on, that we were seeing the revolution, but most of the models were not including large penetration of solar PV in the future. We gathered together and we came up with this paper combining research expertise from different parts of the world, including Matt and Andrew, who are today present there. And we wrote this paper, which I would like to summarize for you to frame this discussion. So what I would like to discuss today are mainly answers to these 4 questions. How did solar PV get so cheap so fast? Do we expect cost reduction to continue? Are there indeed challenges for integrating large shares of solar PV? And then why did many future energy scenarios underestimate solar PV? So let's start with the beginning. How did solar PV get so cheap so fast? Well, PV costs have dramatically reduced thanks to several mechanisms. Of course, we have technical improvements. Those are efficiency gains in the models, cell, silicon production, the uses of larger and thinner wafers. I'm sure Matt will cover some of these issues later. But we also have high-level mechanisms, that is learning by doing. So by manufacturing more and more solar panels, we learn how to do them cheaper. Research, economies of scales, and of course the global standardization in manufacturing and design of PV systems. All of this was combined to obtain what we have an extremely high learning rate. So the learning curve of solar PV, how does the cost of solar PV decreases and as more and more capacity is installed, is the fastest among those electricity generation technologies. And there's one fundamental reason for that, in my view, and that's the fact that solar PV is a granular technology. And this is what enables fast learning. What do I mean by granular technology? Well, if we want to build a rooftop solar installation of 3 kilowatts, we just combine dozens of solar panels. If we want to build the largest existing solar PV park, 2.2 gigawatts, we just combine, or we just use the same solar PV panels, but we use millions of them. And that's what this granularity is what makes it beneficial for solar PV. Of course, it's easier to optimize and automatize the manufacturing of the technology that is composed of the same element, PV model that gets repeated. On top of that, we should also acknowledge that policies that existed and stimulated market growth, even when the technology was not as competitive as it is today, well, those were the policies, and that by that I include feed-in tariffs or renewable portfolio standards. Well, those were the policies that helped the technology become so cheap, so that this is the best option in many parts of the world today. What about the future? Do we expect cost reduction to continue? Well, there are many innovations in the pipeline that could help us keep this high learning rate, so keep the cost reduction. If we look at the efficiency evolution, we can see that from the last 15 years, the efficiency of solar models have kept rising, but we also have options to keep that efficiency and that cost reduction in the future. Some of the options include the use of tandem solar cells by combining different solar cells, each of them transforming into electricity one part of the spectrum or one color of the light. We can attain higher efficiency solar cells. We also have bifacial solar cells, which are systems that convert into electricity irradiance reaching both sides of the solar cell, so the front and the back side of the solar cell. But even more, we not only have innovation in the solar cells, but we also have innovation in the system design. We are now in a new situation where we have very low-cost solar cells, and that enable new configuration. In particular, the dual use of infrastructure. One of the best examples is, of course, building integration, so combining solar PV with existing buildings, but we can be even more innovative. See, for instance, this photograph in which they are using solar PV panels to cover an irrigation channel in India. And by doing that, they are making a dual use of the infrastructure and they are reducing water evaporation because they are covering the water channel. So indeed, there's still a lot of innovation at the solar cell and at the system level. We expect this technology to keep improving. Then, are there real challenges to integrate large cells of solar PV? Well, indeed, there are challenges at different timescales. So we need to balance solar fluctuation, changes in the interannual scale, just so changes from year to year, in the seasonal scale, in the hourly scale, and in the sub-seconds or minutes scale. But my main message here is that we have most of the technology required to do that balancing. So we have strategies to balance interannual variability, seasonal variability, hourly or intraday variability, and different technologies that balance the short-term fluctuations. I'm sure Matt will be discussing most of them, so I'll just skip here. But I would like to emphasize one particular is one of the most challenging aspect is the seasonal variability. So the fact that solar generation is different in winter and summer. However, when we discuss this issue, we need to be aware that there's a significant bias due to the fact that most of the models are run in higher latitudes, so for European and North America. But when we look that in reality, when we look at the seasonal variation in insolation, in radiation, we realize that in reality, most of the world population is living close to the sunbelt. So the location where most of the population lives today, when we expect the highest growth in population, but also in energy demand, are those closer to the equator, where indeed seasonal variation is not a high challenge for integration of solar PV. Then I would also like to discuss this aspect of why then it is that many future energy scenarios did not include a lot of solar PV. And to be honest, this was true a couple of years ago, but now more and more scenarios are including future configurations of the energy system at a country level, at a continental level, at a global level, comprising large shares of solar PV. To do this analysis in the paper, what we did is to plot together the different results from different models. You can see, for instance, here, those coming from the IPCC 5th assessment report, so the report 7 years ago. And we plot them as a function of the solar penetration in the x-axis, so what percentage of electricity is covered with solar, and wind penetration, what percentage of electricity is covered with wind. And we can see that most of these gray squares, all scenarios, well, they were closer to this origin, meaning that they have low penetration of wind and solar. In fact, in a scenario supplying 100% of electricity with wind and solar will be located on the top of this orange line. But what we can see is that the more modern scenarios, the scenarios that include properly modeling on all the balancing strategies that I just described before, so include network and the possibility of balancing with the network, include enough time resolution and the potential role of batteries or other storage technologies such as pumped hydro storage or even conversion of electricity into electrofuels. Well, those scenarios, like the one shown here in red, are approaching the 100% wind and solar electricity, and in particular are reaching high penetration of solar photovoltaic. So the first answer to that question, why it is that many future scenarios underestimated the role of solar, well, is that they were not including proper representation of balancing strategies. But when those strategies are modeled, we indeed see that the cost optimal way of reducing CO2 emissions is to include vast quantities of solar. The second answer to that question has to do with the fact that the cost reduction for solar PV that I was mentioning before, the learning rate was so fast that some of the models get outdated. See, for instance, this figure in which we are comparing the future cost assumption for solar PV in many model different scenarios, so cost assumption from 2010 to 2050. And in the same model, in the same figure, I'm plotting actual other cost forecast, but also real cost from 2020. And in particular, pay attention to this star, which is representing today's average cost for a solar PV system. Well, what's happened is that today's average cost is lower than what some of the models were assuming for 2050. So roughly speaking, the technology learned too fast that it's outdated cost assumption in many models. We did this comparison in our paper, but there are similar results by other authors with the same message. And this is, of course, a call of attention for those doing energy models, but also a call of attention for all of us looking towards the future. There could be technologies that learn extremely fast. So then, as a final slide, I would like to emphasize this idea. Let me move this around. I would like to emphasize this idea that the reality is proving that large penetration of solar PV is possible. Here, in the last figure, we try to represent what percentage of electricity is covered today with solar PV, and the size of every one of these circles represents the size of the power system. So when we look at 2010, there were no major power system, including solar penetration higher than 3%. However, in just 10 years, by 2019, we have many power systems, including large solar penetration. So we have Japan, Australia, Italy, and Germany between 7 and 10%. We have some particular location like South Australia, extremely high. Using data from 2019, probably is slightly higher here now. We have California reaching 20%, and we have some countries that are aiming at having even higher penetration relatively soon or within the next 10 years. So it's important to update our information, our knowledge, and a technology that is changing extremely fast. So let me conclude by emphasizing a few remarks. First, we know that the technology is ready, so solar PV is ready today. It has a large potential to mitigate climate change in the next decade, so from now to 2030. And this will be key to remain in a pathway compatible with the Paris Agreement. So we should make sure that models, when we properly model solar PV and how to balance, they show a large contribution of solar PV in future energy scenarios. Indeed, we have a lot to learn from how this technology was able to develop so fast, and we should make sure that we are considering its potential contribution to the future. I would like to stop here and give the word to Matt, and I'll be happy to discuss questions at the end of the presentation.
So thank you very much, Marta, and she will be available for Q&A after Matt has delivered his talk. So while Matt comes up and gets ready, I'd just like to mention that we award an annual Solar Prize for Best PhD Thesis in the solar area at ANU. And there are quite often some really good theses and from very, very disparate areas. And sometimes it's very, very hard to choose which is the best. And so we've sort of squibbed it this time and chosen two people, one from the solar thermal area, looking at very large scale collection of light to drive chemical reactions, and the other looking in very great detail at the what goes on at the surface and in the bulk of a silicon solar cell. So congratulations to these two people who are the joint winners of the 2020 and 21 Solar Thesis Prize for this year. Unfortunately, they can't be with us. One is in Singapore and the other was not available tonight. But I'd just like to say thank you very much for choosing ANU as your place to do a PhD, and thank you very much for doing such a very fine piece of work. So now we come to Matt Stocks, who is a public servant at the moment, but for many years has been working as a close colleague at ANU, and before that had a completely different life as a silicon solar cell process engineer in the Sliver adventure. So perhaps I'll leave Matt to introduce himself.
Thanks very much, Andrew. So as Andrew points out, I'm wearing two hats tonight, and so for most of tonight I'm going to be wearing the ANU hat, but I will briefly step into the other hat and make that very clear. So tonight I'm wearing an ANU hat, and what I'm saying is in no way a reflection of what the our government's positions might be. So as Andrew pointed out, I've had quite a reasonable period in the solar game. 25 years ago I did a PhD with Andrew looking at high efficiency multicrystalline solar cells, and then I've had 8 years in Origin trying to commercialise the Sliver solar technology, which came out of the ANU looking at a way of trying to reduce the amount of silicon that went into solar cells. But then since then I've been focused much more around how do we integrate lots of renewable energy into our electricity system and moving forward. So I'm going to play across a few different areas as I go through it. The first thing I'm going to start off with is this quote, which kind of contrasts with what Marta was saying, that we are just getting to the point where the world is recognising that solar is ready. And so the IEA in the World Energy Outlook last year said that for good projects with a good solar resource, with really good financing, solar energy is now the cheapest source of electricity in history. Okay? Not now, not for all history. Okay? This is the cheapest source of electricity that we've ever seen. Okay? And so we have this amazing opportunity now to take that and use that to decarbonise our energy sectors. Sorry, I can't move slides. Can I move forward? It's not. Yep. So I should be able to drive it now, or you'll drive it for me? Cool. So Marta talked about the learning curve. So this is my favourite graph in the world. I love this graph. Back in the early 90s, sorry, maybe late 90s, it was recognised that if we plotted the amount of solar we'd made against the price, then, and we did this on a log-log graph, so you'll see the vertical axis is a logarithmic scale, it's factors of 10 up, and the horizontal scale is how much we've deployed, factor of 10 scales. It made a straight line. Now there's no reason it should be a straight line. Okay? It's not a fundamental thing, but it is. So if I'm in industry and I'm looking at that curve, what do I think I've got to do next year? I've got to make things cheaper. And we've got this wonderful feedback of if I make stuff, I get better at making stuff, and so I make it cheaper. If I make something cheaper, then more people want to buy it. And when more people want to buy it, I make more of it, and so I learn how to do it better and I make more of it. And there's this lovely relationship that every time we double the number of solar panels we put out, we roughly decrease the price by about 20%. And we did this for, you can see that started in 1979. I started a bit later than that. I was sort of a decade after that, so sort of count 10 points down, around about the $10 mark. That's where I started playing in it. But we had this lovely relationship that cost us, we put more stuff out there and the costs came down. Okay? So round about where I've hidden things, that's about when I went into industry. So that's when we tried to have a go with of making sliver solar cells and trying to take the ANU technology and get it to scale. And woohoo, prices didn't go down, it was great. Because I was on the other side of the fence and I was trying to make cheaper solar cells, and if everyone else wasn't, then that took the pressure off me a little bit. Can we go back? No. Can we go back, please? Back. Okay. So what happened there? We ran out of silicon. Okay. All of these solar cells are being made out of silicon, and what we did at that stage, we relied on the semiconductor industry. Okay. We were using their scrap. So basically, they had lots of wafers that didn't quite meet spec or something went wrong with, and they got fed into the solar industry. Semiconductor industry was much bigger than the solar industry, and we're using the same stuff, silicon. Okay, what you make a really good, the things in, not my phone, in this microphone or whatever else it is in that computer is made out of the same stuff as we make solar cells out of. And we ran out. So something that was about $20 a kilo suddenly became $400 a kilo because we were growing. Everyone wanted to make more of it. We were going to compete by growing bigger and getting better and whatever else. And so prices stayed flat because silicon was expensive. So at that point we worked out, hang on, we can't rely on the semiconductor industry anymore. And so I'm going to throw in an anecdote there. At that time I was looking for silicon. And so I was spending some time in China talking to some of the manufacturers. And at one particular place I went, there was a building that was about the size of 3 basketball courts. And it was completely and utterly filled of Chinese women, and it was Chinese women, with a a little probe, pressing these broken little pieces of wafer, working out whether they were N-type or P-type to work out whether they could be used for solar or not. Okay? And they were just sorting through this because it was worth it. Every little scrap of silicon we wanted to be putting into a solar panel. I visited the same plant 2 years later, if we can now go, and China started making polysilicon. Okay? And they worked out how to do it well and how to make it cheaper and do it at scale. And so we got back to the curve. Okay? Silicon prices came down. But what do you think everyone was doing during that time that prices was high in terms of trying to focus on everything else? They were working really hard to pull the cost out of everything else that they could, because I can't save money in silicon because I've got to work on everything else I possibly can. So, whoops, we went a bit far. We didn't just hit the curve again, we went below the curve. So right through that period, everyone was sitting there going, it's going to run out eventually. And when we hit that silicon supply crunch, everyone went, oh, is this the end of it? Are we really going to be able to keep pushing prices down? I'm glad I'm not in the industry anymore. It's just amazing. The numbers there I just could not conceive of a decade or 2 decades ago. It just blows me away. Okay. There isn't any sign of stopping yet. Okay, next. And it's happening everywhere in it. It's people are looking at the silicon. How do I use less silicon in my solar cell? So the bottom line is the cost of silicon. What's the cost of the silicon that goes into it? So how can we use less of it? How can I make wafers thinner? How can I improve yield? How can I make those wafers less scrappy? How do I then turn that silicon into a wafer cheaply? How do I make them thinner? How do I cut them? We've gone from using this grit material to using diamond impregnated wire because we can cut less silicon and less of it ends up on the floor as dust and more of it ends up in our solar panels. How do I make my solar cell cheaper? There's just layer on layer of everyone is doing everything they can to squeeze things out because they know that prices have to get cheaper because we all believe the price is going to get cheaper, so we're all working really hard to make the price cheaper. Next slide. And the industry has this amazing document, which is their roadmap, where everyone in the industry gets together and says, this is what I think is going to happen. And it's a really useful document for everyone because everyone talks about what it is that we're trying to achieve and everyone is aligned. And the industry can go and look at it and go, okay, silver. Oh, geez. Everyone's forecasting that we're going to be using a lot less silver. What's that going to mean for my equipment? How am I going to be able to do a screen printing process better? What have I got to go? How the pace is going to have to change? Some bright spark went, well, what if instead of having this big solar cell, because one of the challenges with a solar cell is that they're really low voltage, high current. One solar cell is only 0.6 of a volt, but it's 8 amps, 9 amps of current. What if I cut it in half? I make the solar cell big, so I get all the benefits of scale of making these big things, but then I just cut it in half. Then I can put less silver on. And instead of putting, I don't know, if you saw a solar panel 10 years ago, there were 2 big fat wires running through it all. Somebody went, what if instead of 2 I do 3 or 4 or 5 or 6? There's 10 and 12 bus bars now running across these things because we worked out how to do the automation better, so we can put down these really thin wires, and then we can have less silver because we have to move the current less far to get to the nearest bus bar. And so what you can see there is this particular graph doesn't just show what the forecast is this year. It's actually went back and looked at all of the forecasts in the past. And there's a few times there where the price of silver went up and everyone goes, oh, we're going to have to pull a bit more out. But then it comes back and there's this, look, I'm pretty confident that there's going to be 0.05 grams of silver per cell in 2030 because everyone believes it. And that's basically what everyone's agreeing with and forecasting, and everyone's driving in that direction. And it's the same thing for how much silicon are we going to use, how much aluminium we're going to put in a frame, how's the technology going to change, which is just helping to push things down. Next slide, please. But that's just the module. Okay, if we don't make electricity just from the module, I have to put it out in the field and collect that energy. So there's been some really clever stuff, and this is Australian tech, around how do I modularize deployment. So Marta pointed out that one of the real powers of solar has been this idea that we have this single building block that I can do anything with. I can put it on your roof, or I can build a whole solar farm with exactly the same bit of tech. And it's just this cut and repeat. I'm just going to make lots of them, and I'm going to get really good at making lots of them, and then I'm going to make more of them and get better and better and better and better. Really nice idea. Somebody came up, and this is 5B Tech, is Sydney-based. Simeon's suddenly become the CTO there, so he's an ex-ANU alum. What if we put it all together in a factory and put it in a container and then just lay it out with a crane on site? So what you see on the right here is a whole collection of modules have been folded together, and all the electricity, all the electrical connections, all of the wiring, all of the mounting on frames has been done in a factory. Not out in the sunshine, can be done 24/7. And then let's pick this up, and you can see 2 or 3 guys, one driving the crane, 2 on the sides making sure everything lines up. They can just churn these things out. Now, it's not tracking, unfortunately, but I reckon they'd be thinking pretty hard about how they're going to incorporate that. So there's really clever thinking, not just in how do I make the module cheaper, how do I make the inverter cheaper, how do I use less cables, how do I make that entire system cheaper? And it just keeps getting cheaper, and everyone believes it's going to keep getting cheaper. So this is NREL, so the National Renewable Energy Labs in the US, looking at what the levelized cost. So that's what's the average price I need to sell my solar electricity for over the life of the project to make money. And the vertical lines there are around how good is the solar resource. And so for Australia, we can pretty much look at the bottom 2 lines, the yellow and the blue and the black squares. That we still believe that there's just going to be this continuous push down in terms of what the costs are going to be down there. And so that's looking down at, I don't know, 15 to 20 US cents. So that's sort of 20, 25 Australian dollars, 2 to 2.5 cents Australian a kilowatt hour for electricity. It's farcically low. So this is where I put my other hat on. I've got my DESA hat on for a minute here. So we've gone for our audacious goal for this year, and it's the ultra low cost solar, and that's ARENA is driving the 30-30-30. So that's 30 cents a watt. So that's a good step down from the 40 cents US up there for a deployed system. 30% efficiency. So the stuff that silicon can't get to 30. Well, sorry, I don't know how to get silicon to 30. Do you know how to get silicon to 30, Andrew? I don't think we're going to get silicon to 30. It's a fundamental part of just having one energy band gap that it can have. So tandem solar cells, where we start to combine silicon with something else, is going to take us to 30. So the work that's being done on perovskites at ANU, lots of competition around records, how are we going to get silicon beyond just silicon? What can we add with silicon to get to 30%? with an aim of 2030. Okay, so aiming even higher than that because it's going to unlock all sorts of extra things that we can do if we can drive that cost even lower. Okay, and new hat back on. Next slide, please. Sorry, I messed up my automation. Never mind. Can we just see if we can go back one? No. Okay, sorry. So what you would be able to see on here is, coming back to the quote from IEA, 4 good quality solar resources. And Australia does have really good solar resources. So unfortunately, I've hidden behind there Tasmania. Tasmania sits right towards the bottom end of that power range, so 1,300 kilowatt hours of solar irradiation per year. Okay. Germany? The best in Germany doesn't even get to Tasmania. We're spoiled. Sorry, Marta, you're north of there. It's not looking good. It's better in Southern Europe. Solar has a role in Europe, no question. But we do have an amazing solar resources, which is one of the real pluses that we have in terms of being able to use it to enable other things. I'm going much slower than I should be. Where am I at time-wise? Oops. Okay, next slide, please. So one of the amazing things about the Australian story is that it's been rooftop solar. And I strongly remember when I came back to ANU in 2013, Kylie Catchpole, another researcher in ANU, did a popular article around Australia hit 1 million solar rooftop systems. And that was just amazing. 8 years later, we've hit 3 million. Oh, okay. And it's a no-brainer. 4 years is the average payback period in Australia. 4 years. So let's 20+% tax-free. Free, tax-free. Tell me where you can invest at that rate. I'll jump on it very happily. No risk as well, remember. So this is guaranteed returns. So you can see why everyone's going down that route. And Australia has set up a system where it is easy. Okay? There is an expectation that you can connect. Okay? There is a lot of parts of the world. Indonesia, it's hard. And Paul can speak to that. They're trying, but it's hard. Okay? There are just rules and obstructions all over the place. In Australia, if I want to put in solar, I put in solar. Okay? I might be constrained if I want to put in more than 5 kilowatts. I might have to go 3-phase if I want to put 15. Oh dear, it's a tough old world we live in, isn't it? 4-year payback. The slide down the bottom left. Brown coal is the brown down the very bottom. 2 years ago, that would never have been anything other than a flat line going across the screen. Okay, so that's 3 days. Last week, I think. Okay, brown coal base load is having to ramp down in Victoria because there is so much solar in our system. And you can see that there's light yellow and dark yellow in that yellow. The light yellow is rooftop solar. It is rooftop solar which is squeezing coal out of the system. So please keep installing it. If you put in 1 kilowatt, go and put in 5. If you put in 5, go and put in 10. Okay, that is what's squeezing coal at the moment. It's putting real pressure on. Next slide, please. Oh dear. So what's the future going to look like? So South Australia is leading the way. So last week, so that's a week in South Australia, 77% wind and solar. Okay, I think we've gone past you, Marta. Marta's in Denmark. They were leading the way with the wind installation there. I think South Australia's probably snuck past now in terms of total amount of variable renewables. And you can see there are challenges associated with it. Okay, there's times when we're going to have lots of energy, and there are times when we're going to have a shortage of energy. Okay, there are periods where there are really fast ramp rates, okay, ramping up and then ramping down again. Okay, it is a different system to what we saw in that previous slide where everything just changes nice and gently and we can just plan and pull our way through things. Next slide, please. But we know what we have to do there. And it's not just that we as academics or we as out there, it's AEMO as well know what they've got to do there. Okay, they're doing the integrated system plan with a vision to this new electricity system is going to be full of wind and solar. Okay, so we don't want to just have wind and we don't want to just have solar. A mix is better than any one on its own. Spread them out, and I'll show you in the next slide why spreading them out is really important, but transmission is really important. How can I be clever about when I use energy? When I have lots of energy, what can I use it for? When I don't have as much energy, what can I switch off? We have to start thinking about those things. And the last thing we want to do is use storage. Okay? But eventually we get to the point where storage is useful. Okay? Storage is expensive, it's inefficient. We don't want to do it until it makes sense. Okay, next slide, please. So transmission. Transmission developments have been amazing. China, they have a single transmission line, 3,000 kilometres, 10 gigawatts of power with 10% loss. Okay, high voltage DC, 1.1 million volts. Okay, very, very high voltage. But real pluses with HVDC when you want to move energy really long distances around. And the Australian network is roughly 3,000 kilometres north to south. So being able to move energy around is going to be really important. Okay? So I think of transmission about shifting energy in space. I want to move it from this place to another place. Next slide, please. And it does an amazing job of averaging things out. So what I'm seeing here is on the left, this is all the solar farms in Australia for a day, and on the right is all the wind farms in Australia for a day. Okay? You look at any one of them, you go, oh my God, it's all up and down and changing and varying, and this is high and this is low. The black line's the average of them all. Suddenly it all just, that variation is much dramatically reduced. My wind, yeah, it changes from 40% to 50% through the day, but it's happening slowly. We can react, we can cope with this. Okay? Transmission is this wonderful beast to be able to move energy in space and average out those weather effects. Okay? If the wind's not blowing here, probably is in South Australia, or maybe it is in far north Queensland. Okay? The challenge there is going to be social license, and we're already seeing it. Okay? Instead of a wind farm, where we've gone through the process of working out how do we get a community on side. Okay, there are all sorts of approaches in terms of community engagement and sponsoring this and subsidising that and engaging with the community so that everyone sees that there's value in this. Transmission line just goes 1,000 kilometres through how many people's land? Hundreds? Thousands potentially? So there's a real challenge there because we've come from a background where the state just said that's where it's going and we're going to put it in there to one where we need to have the communities on side. So there's a real challenge there around the transmission story. Next slide, please. One forward, please. Or two forward. So I won't do the surprise and ask the question. I'll just tell you what it is. Sorry, Lois. Really isn't fair to use animation. The big Tesla battery. Okay, so world's biggest battery when it was built a few years ago. That rectangle in a week of South Australia represents what it can deliver. Amazing technology for power. If I want a burst of energy in the system, really cheap way of getting power into the system. Okay, and is great at coping with sudden rapid variations in the system and did suddenly a transmission line trips in far north Queensland, trips off a coal generator. The battery in South Australia, bang, kicks in and starts to try and recover frequency in the whole system. Amazing tech for doing that. So great for power. So if I wanted to be able to deliver that burst of energy into the system, and even for 3, 4, 5, 6 hour sort of time periods. Next one, please. Go forward 2. That's snowy. All of South Australia for a whole week. Okay, so now, don't know what's going to be the storage mix going forward, but we are going to be having to deal with both power and energy within the system going forward. But we've got the technologies now, okay, and we can. It's not a major problem. Skip forward 2, please. Okay, great. We've got a renewable grid, and I know the sessions that you've had earlier, anyone who was in earlier, it's now electrify everything. Okay, once we've got a zero emissions or a low emissions electricity grid, then how can we use that cheap, low emissions energy to do other things? But it's not necessarily easy. Okay, how many people have got an electric vehicle today? Okay, how many people think they're going to have an electric vehicle in 2030? It's pretty rapid change. What's your vehicle going to do in 2030? Is it going to be autonomous? What's the vote? Autonomous up? Okay, so what's your vehicle going to do in the middle of the day? Are you going to have it at work with you, or are you going to send it home to charge on your rooftop solar? How do I plan for that? I don't know which one of these it's going to be. Is it going to be a share? So how many actually believe that they're going to own a vehicle in 2030 for most of what they do? Is it going to be the Tesla model that they own it and you're just going to phone up and, sorry, how dare I say phone up? I'm going to tap my app and my phone and a car's going to turn up in 5 minutes and take me to work. So we're going to electrify transport. I think that's the no-brainer. But how's it going to work in the system? I don't know. It's going to be some fun working it out. And then we can do low temperature heat and we can do high temperature heat, and there are all sorts of things that we can do once we've got a low emissions electricity system. So what are we going to do next? We're going to power the world. Sun cable. Okay. Singapore has a space problem. We're really lucky. We've got plenty of space. Singapore, much more of a challenge. So the scale of that solar farm, 17 to 20 gigawatts, that's the size of everything we've done today. Okay? We're talking massive scale projects that get unlocked when we have this cheap source of energy available. Next slide. So some of you who would have been in the early ones would have seen what some of the work that's being done in the zero carbon energy for the Asia Pacific work. So what if can we use that energy to replace LNG? Maybe. Okay. We can use hydrogen. Okay, take our electricity, convert it into hydrogen, have a chemical storage, and use that to do some of the things that we would have done with liquefied natural gas. Okay. To replace all of our LNG exports with hydrogen, we're talking hundreds of gigawatts of wind and solar. Okay, so driving down those costs really, really important, but a massive opportunity now that we have. Targets of $2 a kilo. We see 55 kilowatt hours of energy required to produce a kilogram of hydrogen. If we can't get $35 a megawatt hour for electricity, then just the energy costs are going to kill us for hydrogen. So those sort of $15, $20 a megawatt hour sort of numbers are going to be really important to be able to drive down the cost of hydrogen. Next, please. Or we can do green ammonia. So it's not the Asia Renewable Energy Hub, it's the Western Green Energy Hub. Massive renewable energy project in WA looking at delivering green ammonia. So instead of having hydrogen as the vector for doing useful things, throw a nitrogen atom with it. It's easier to compress, easier to move around, and there's already an existing market. It's a fertilizer. So there's already a natural market existing for it. Again, a project which is talking about 20 gigawatt plus potentially 50 gigawatt scale project. Next, please. Green metals. I'm sure John filled a number of people in this afternoon around the opportunity again there. In steel making, we use carbon to rip the oxygen off of the iron. Okay, so we're not using it so much for energy. A big part of what we're doing is how do we chemically get the oxygen away from the iron. Okay, and so hydrogen is one of the avenues that's being looked at there. Again, if we want to have something that's going to be competitive with conventional steel, we need to have really low-cost energy, and solar is looking like the vector that's going to enable a lot of those processes. Next. And eventually, low-cost energy might allow us to reverse some of the CO2 that's gone into the atmosphere. So direct air capture is the idea of directly capturing CO2 from the air, okay, and then we can use that either to make synthetic fuels, so to try and deal with particularly aviation. It's really tough to see what we're going to do with aviation, biofuels is one route, but there's all sorts of challenges with biofuels competing with food production and challenges around land use. We can make synthetic fuels. So we can take that CO2, combine it with some hydrogen, and make our synthetic fuel so that we can still travel around the world. Or, again, if we've got cheap energy, we can push that CO2 underground, okay, and capture some of that CO2 that we've put into the atmosphere and see if we can reverse some of those impacts. Starting to be demonstration, but still relatively expensive capital-wise. But if we can do the same sort of learning with that as we've done with our solar and with our wind and with our semiconductor chips, then there's real opportunities to pull the capital out, and then cheap energy is what's going to be important. Okay, next slide, please. And coming back to what Marta said at the end of hers, I've got exactly the same theme at the end of ours. Solar is the future for the bulk of the world's population. Okay, the vast majority of the population, so Marta's had one thing, mine is that between plus and minus 35 is where 70% of the world's population lives. Okay, no seasonal variation of solar, or very low. No cold winters, okay? All the challenges that Europe sees, you can see Europe's way off of that. North America is outside of that, okay? They have different challenges to what the Sun Belt has, okay? We've been doing work on Indonesia, and David Silai, the PhD student that's working on that with us, did some analysis looking at how much did solar vary on a day-to-day basis versus a 2-day versus 3, these different time durations. Who's been to Bali? Is there any time that it makes any difference to go there? Because the analysis we did on variation of the solar was just, it was like no matter what 2-day period we looked at, we always got 80% of the solar. Like in 2 days. We only need to store energy for 2 days at worst within Indonesia. And there's just this massive population that lives in that exact same region. And it's a region that's growing, okay? All of Indonesia, 115 million, is that the right number? 300, oh, sorry, I'm hopeless. 300 million, 10 times our population, same energy, electricity use as we have. They're not going to be happy with that. They shouldn't be happy with that, okay? They're going to change, they're going to grow, and hopefully solar is going to help deliver it. So, in conclusion, I went digging around for a quote, and I fell across this one. I'm so glad I did. "90 years ago. So there's a challenge for us. Solar century, 100 years from when Thomas Edison said this. Can we make sure that we've got solar running our world before that coal and oil completely destroys it? Thanks very much for your attention.
Okay, so thank you very much, Matt. That was a great talk and a great compliment to Marta's talk. And so we throw the floor open to questions, and also all of the online people, please go to the online platform that was mentioned previously to set up your questions. So perhaps somebody from the audience initially. There's a problem with the online thing. Well, let's have a hands up and talk loudly from the audience, and perhaps I might kick it off, Matt. Do you think that in 2030 we will still be talking about fossil fuels, or will we have moved on and be talking about what we do in 2040? How do you think the politics or the community discussion of this is going to move on?
I think the community discussion has already moved on largely. It's one of the real interesting aspects in this space is that we do have strong community belief that change is needed and change will become and change should happen quickly. And you can see New South Wales has a 50% reduction target, Victoria has a 50% reduction target. I guess I'll come back to what Shane pointed out, is that at the moment what we're seeing is the states are stepping up where other policy vacuum exists. And I think that's because the general populace is on board. I think there is a desire for change. I think there is a general recognition now that what we are experiencing is climate change, and I think that's been one of the real challenges over the last several decades, is that it's all been in the future. And one of the real pluses, if you like, which is not a plus, but one of the real things is that we now actually have concrete things where people can look at to what they are experiencing is different to what they experienced in the past. That we are experiencing bushfire events that people had not seen in the past, that we are seeing droughts that are more severe, and we're seeing temperature extremes which are greater than what we've seen in the past. And so people have something concrete to hang it on. And I think that has been one of the challenges getting to this point, is that we haven't, we're not very good at envisaging the future and just listening to people and saying, this is what's going to happen if you don't change. And I think that's one of the real powerful things now, is that that pressure is now, and that's driving things. What's your view in Europe, Marta?
Sure, I kind of agree on what you are saying, Matt. The conversation has already changed, and we are already not talking anymore about fossil fuels. But it's really difficult for us to imagine the future because things are changing extremely fast. So we should be prepared to see changes as dramatic as those that we have witnessed for solar PV. So I'm quite optimistic regarding the future, because we have the technology, we're going to install vast quantities of solar and wind, and we're going to have that technology even becoming cheaper and cheaper in the future.
So just moving along on the same theme, Marta, Denmark and South Australia happen to be the global leaders in solar and wind. And perhaps you could give a perspective from the Danish point of view of Denmark being very far ahead of most of the rest of Europe and on a par with what's happening in South Australia.
Yeah, that's true. So Denmark today has a wind penetration that on average covers more than 50% of the electricity demand, annual electricity demand, and we have situations, days in which the wind energy is producing more than 100% of the electricity demand, and it's covering all the national demand, and electricity is also exported out of Denmark. And of course, this has challenges, but also a lot of benefits. So Denmark is becoming high expert in the technology and the strategies to balance high wind penetration, and that technology can be later exported. Or what my main point is that it's great to be a front runner on this energy transition. So it's great that South Australia is the first one dealing with the challenges and trying different strategies to overcome them. Because it's showing that it's possible, and it's learning a lot. It's kind of leading the learning. And as I mentioned, being the front runner has a lot of benefits. And what is more important, I think those kind of countries can also be an inspiration. So it's inspiring to see how for some days all the electricity that we consume is coming from wind and solar, because this is the future. So it's really inspiring to have countries already achieving that future. It's kind of setting the path where we should all go in the sooner the better.
So in Australia, and I think also in Northern Europe, transmission is the key impediment. Solar farms, wind farms, pumped hydro, battery systems all occupy just small areas of land. You can just talk with a few farmers and get permission. Whereas transmission, as Matt pointed out, traverses hundreds of properties. So So Matt, in Australia, transmission is somewhat easier than it would be in Denmark, trying to connect to southern Germany, for example. How do you envisage that the transmission impediments can be overcome? Is undergrounding a solution, or how would you see this playing out?
I think if we end up in a situation where we have to go underground, then what it will just end up producing is a very inefficient, expensive system. What you would end up there is just lots more storage, and underground transmission is just so much more expensive, and the distances that we need to move energy in Australia just would completely and utterly break it. So, look, I think there are elements around, to be a little bit flippant, it's around education and taking people on a journey that we need our system to change, and this is part of that change, is that there's going to be a need for that, that recognising that the impacts of global warming are going to far outweigh the impact of a single transmission line, and that's a really difficult conversation to have, but if it's part of our trade-offs and what people are thinking of around that. But it is aspects around the transmission companies do have to learn how to go and have conversations with people and try and come up with a genuine consultation process. And they're trying and they're starting to. But it is hard because unlike a wind farm where, look, if you just get to the point where the community says no, well, that's right, I'll go 50 kilometres down the road and they might say yes. I do physically need to get from this location to this location, and there's only so many ways I can do it. So I think there will be some solutions that emerge that are just going to be very Western, that we're just going to go into areas that are easier because there are just less people, but there's just going to be a need to work out what the right way of keeping the people in that transmission pathway happy.
So Marta, in Europe, of course, there's plenty of southern sun and there's enormous offshore wind resources in the North Sea. And somehow or other, that wind has to go south and the solar has to go north. Can you perhaps talk for a bit about how that would actually be accomplished in Europe, given the well-known opposition in countries like Germany to any change whatsoever to the landscape?
Yeah, that's really an issue now, and it's true that there is a significant public opposition to new transmission lines. And as Matt was saying, we need to acknowledge that if we cannot use transmission lines, or if we need to use underground transmission lines, then the solution is going to be more expensive. So I think this is a whole discussion that we need to have together as a society. We need, as Europeans, have this discussion together. Because any additional constraint that we add, so if we don't want to extend transmission lines, if we don't want to, there's also some public opposition to new wind farms, onshore wind farms. So if we don't allow some of the technologies, the result is that the system will be more expensive. And we have a pressing issue. So we have climate change, and consequences are going to be dramatic. So we need, as a society, to decide how much do we want to pay for this transition, and to acknowledge that every additional limitation that we add will result in an increase in cost. I think there is a need for education, but also for reflecting and for discussing as a society what are going to be the trade-offs and what are going to be the new infrastructure that we need to accept as being part of this transition. I also think that it's important that we are participating now in a lot of public discussions, presentation, places where people can join together and discuss, because this is, as I mentioned, a decision that we should take as a society. So I'm confident that with much more public discussion, we can shift a little bit this idea or we can convince a little bit those who are reluctant to new infrastructure that indeed they are needed if we want to decarbonize our energy system in time. But I agree with what you have both said. It's indeed one of the challenges for the energy transition in Europe and in many other parts in the world.
So turning to synthetic fuels, you mentioned that in your presentation, Matt, shipping and aircraft are quite hard to run on electricity. So is a synthetic fuel made from atmospheric CO2 and water truly greenhouse neutral or close to it, or is there still substantial residual greenhouse emissions?
So I think it possibly depends a bit where you are on the journey. So has John delivered me green steel? So what am I making this stuff out of? So there is emissions when I make something. There's emissions when I move something to another place at the moment, and there are emissions when I'm doing things. So there's a whole ecosystem that has to be built around it. That are they as a whole zero emissions? In theory, we can get to a point where all of the inputs to that particular product have been produced from renewable sources of energy. We still will have an impact, that local impact around mining. We're still going to need copper and steel and aluminium and cobalt and lithium and a whole collection of... So it's not going to be zero impact on the environment. There is going to be localised impacts, but I think we can get the emissions to extraordinarily low levels. And then can we start to look at using technology to create negative emissions, not just nature? That's then the opportunity that we have on top of that.
So Marta, we all read about shocking prices for gas and coal in Europe, for imported gas from Russia and other places. What effect is this happening on the discussion in Europe about the renewable energy transition? Is it causing politicians to say, oh, we need to go and find some more gas, or is it causing them to say, oh, we better put some more wind and solar in?
I think that's an extremely relevant question. I think a little bit of both. So some people are saying, well, see what's happened because we shut down coal, or we have plans for shutting down nuclear, but in particular, the coal discussion is being used by some people to say now we depend strongly on gas, and because we have prices in Europe are going high, and the reflection is, it can also be understood as the opposite. So we are still so dependent on gas because we don't have enough wind and solar. So we could accelerate the installation of wind and solar, who will be less reliable on gas prices. So this is also serving as an argument for trying to push forward for the installation of wind and solar. And I might say that we also need to be extremely careful with the electricity prices, because it's not only about decarbonizing the electricity sector, but this transition also requires that we use electricity to decarbonize other sectors, such as heating. So we start using heat pumps, or we shift from our cars to electric vehicles. And that's also needed that the consumers can rely on electricity.
Sorry, you're fading out a bit there, Marta. So just while we wait to see whether the connection to you is established.
So this with high electricity on some of the consumers because they feel less confident to ignite. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I think you're breaking up a bit. I'll just ask Matt a question while we see if we can get the connection back. So you could imagine a future for both Norway and Australia, which are both big fossil fuel exporters, where we go to 100% renewable energy, but still export vast amounts of coal, oil and gas. What would be your feelings about such an Australia, or if you're in Norway, such a Norway?
Well, there is really conflicting information out there in terms of what does the world actually going to want from us in the future. So there's a real challenge there around something in the ground no longer has any value. So there is, you can understand why oil and gas and coal companies are pushing for Australia to maintain this industry going forward, and states also see significant revenue from our existing fossil fuels. And so there is a real challenge there around the value of something is completely lost, something that has a significant value to individuals. So the question then becomes, if there is a market for it, if China, Japan, Korea, whoever it is wants that product, should Australia provide it or not? And that gets into really interesting moral and economic questions. It's a real tension there around providing leadership and saying we're going to stop producing this material because it's bad for the world, as distinct from I'm going to stop producing this material because nobody wants it anymore.
That's a classic question. Should we be exporting cigarettes, although we're clamping down on cigarette smoking in Australia?
But we haven't banned it. And this is that... I'm glad I don't have to be the one making that decision. And it's the conversation I was having with Frank before this was, it's really easy to talk about the future of this well, there's going to be all these jobs, and we're going to be exporting hydrogen and making green steel, and there's these new industries. But to be the representative of in Hunter or in the Latrobe or in central Queensland, and to walk up to a voter and say, your job's not important anymore. We're going to create all these other new jobs, but your job's not important anymore. That's hard. Okay? As a politician, that is hard to say you are not important anymore to your local electorate. I can see why Joel Fitzgibbon struggles. I can see the challenge associated with that. And so until we get to a position where we have a bipartisan view in Australia that this is the pathway forward, we're going to see this tension around how do we transition. And that's the really unfortunate thing in the Australian context, is that we've had this, the success of the abolition of the carbon tax has really created a wedge between the two sides of politics that are really trying to keep themselves apart, that each of them sees this as an issue which they can shift the dial on. And until both sides of politics come together in a unified way around climate, we're going to see, should we still be exporting fossil fuels? Should we be doing this in this place, or banning this, or stopping that? The ideal is that we get to a point where we have a roadmap and a pathway, and this is how we're going to try and get there.
Well, thanks, Matt. We've just got time for one more question to each. So Marta, what's your gut feeling about what will happen in Europe? Are you going to have a two-speed Europe where countries like Denmark and Germany really zoom ahead in dealing with climate change, and other parts of the European Union are a dead weight anchor? Or do you think the whole European Union will be able to move ahead?
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer. I think, of course, we're going to have some countries which are going to act as the front runner, and of course Denmark is going to be one of them. We really hope that other countries can catch up, and we have European mechanisms, like we have an European CO2 market setting up the price. So we try to have same rules for everyone. But of course, the situation for the different countries in Europe is very different in terms of how good is the wind and solar resource, and how good is the economy. So I'm afraid we are always going to have this different speed, but I can also see this as a benefit. So those countries who have good wind resources and good economic capacities, they should be in the front and try to lead the transition. And somehow we have internal compensation mechanisms to economically help those other countries that are a little behind to catch up, because Europe as a whole European Union is the entity that is committed to reducing climate change. So the entity that has signed the Paris Agreement is the European Union. So we should make sure that all the member states are reaching CO2 reduction on time.
Thanks. And perhaps a last comment from you, Matt. It's, of course, difficult to forecast the future. Do you think that Australia's current global leadership in terms of per capita solar and wind will continue and even accelerate in the sense that the compelling economics of solar and wind runs right over the top of objections? Or do you think that Australia might slip back in these league tables?
I'm pretty optimistic, I think, as an individual and as a technologist. So I'll make one comment first, and that is I would hate to be a large-scale solar builder today. Rooftop solar is completely destroying the market for large-scale solar, which makes it really hard for that. But I am optimistic that we will change the way that we use energy in a way that will unlock large-scale solar. So things like the greening of steel, that we're going to develop hydrogen industry and therefore be able to create low-emission steel through ripping that oxygen off with hydrogen. Solar is going to be the cheapest source of energy for that. And the world is increasingly looking to low-carbon products. We can see Europe's introduced the carbon border adjustment taxes around if you have a high-carbon product, they're going to charge you more as a duty to import that into Europe. US is talking about it. Other countries are probably going to start to adopt that unless you make a product which is lower emissions, then you're going to be penalised. Whether you have a carbon tax in Australia or not is going to be irrelevant. And that's where I see some of the real big opportunities. Is solar is going to be such a low-cost source of energy that people are going to work out clever ways to use that to produce products which the world wants.
Okay, well, it's now 7 o'clock and time to wrap up. I'd just like to thank Marta and Matt very much. I think there's more knowledge in their two heads than in entire governments. I'd also like to thank Minister Rattenbury for earlier describing what's going on in the ACT, which I do not include in that derogatory comment, as certainly the Australian leader in terms of moving ahead. And I'd like to thank the organisers for a very challenging IT exercise, and they got it right, and congratulations, and thank you everybody for attending both physically and virtually. So thank you and good night. You got to come and help eat it all.